My task is to hopefully inform you as to some of the realities behind the proposed cannabis legislation, which we will get a chance to vote on as one of two referenda in the upcoming election. And next week you'll hear about the End of Life Choice Act, but tonight we talk cannabis. I want to just briefly lay out what the legislation proposes will happen and then talk about some of the realities we see overseas. Essentially, what's being proposed is two new ways for members of the public to obtain cannabis. One in a highly regulated way through shops that will be selling cannabis products that have a cap of potency of around 15% THC. Keep that number in mind. We'll talk about that before we're finished. And you'll be able to purchase 14 grams of cannabis a day. In the old money, that's about half an ounce. Back in the days where I was a user, an ounce would have taken me and my flatmates a couple of weeks to get through. So that's a lot of cannabis for your daily allotment. Purchased through a store if you're 20 and over. That age limit we'll talk about as well. The other thing that will happen is that individuals will be permitted to grow cannabis plants, 2 per adult with a maximum of 4 in their home. Of course, those plants won't be regulated. They won't be tested, which you can immediately see undermines the whole idea of regulation. The hope is not bad. The aspiration is not bad. The hope is that somehow people would leave the black market and start purchasing a much more known and safe product from a store. That's the idea. It's a concession that smoking and using cannabis is going to happen either way. So rather than letting the black market sell people who knows what it is and what it might be laced with, people could at least purchase a safe product. That's the aspiration, that's the hope. The other hope, of course, is that people will stop being criminalized for simply smoking a joint and using cannabis the way many people use alcohol, just as a recreational substance that adults are permitted to use. Why should cannabis not be used the same way? So the law would advocate for. So Say No to Dope is not a faith-based campaign, although we draw from many faith-based groups, both Christian and Muslim, would you believe? This is one of those issues that finds friends in all kinds of places. The campaign's not a faith-based campaign. It's an evidence-based campaign, but I'm sure that we can draw our links to what it might mean for those of us for whom our Christian faith is so important. So let's address some of the issues. One is the issue of criminalisation. Well, for a start, it's well overstated. In New Zealand, only 16 people in the last 3 years have received a jail sentence or home detention for personal use of cannabis. It's simply not true that you go to jail in New Zealand for smoking cannabis. For 20 years, the New Zealand police have had the approach of giving people a pre-charge warning if they find you smoking cannabis. In reality, they take your joint off you, they scrunch it up, put it in the bin and send you on your way. They're not interested in users. They haven't been in a long time. Policing time is dedicated on growers and sellers, and it would need to be under legalization. What you and I need to keep in mind is that this is the beginning of a much wider idea. The New Zealand Drug Foundation has admitted now in 2017 that their model drug law reform policy would have every drug decriminalized. Heroin, cocaine, P, whatever you can think of, they believe it should all be legalized. This is a huge, huge problem. This is the beginning of our society moving in a direction that is troublesome for most of us. So what happens overseas? That's what we decided we would try and find out. What happens in jurisdictions that have legalized? Did it happen that people went for this safe, regulated market? And the answer is not really. In Canada, one of the more recent places to legalize, and one of the first Western country or OECD country to legalize, they found in the year since legalization that only 29% of users are purchasing solely from the legal outlet. So evidently, committing a crime is not that big of a problem because 71% of users in Canada are more than happy to keep buying their cannabis from the black market. And everywhere we've looked, the black market remains, and it remains strong. So this is what happens. Instead of creating this safe, regulated bubble as is planned, you create a commercial environment, and competition between the legal market and the black market drives the price down. In Canada, A gram of legal cannabis is $10. A gram of black market cannabis is $5.90, and it's twice as strong. You see, that's the other problem, is that for many of us, when we're thinking about cannabis, we might be thinking about the cannabis of the 60s or 70s, what's been dubbed the Woodstock weed. Its THC level was only 3%. THC is the part that makes you high. In the 1990s, when I was a user, the THC level was around 10%. It's now around 30%. Now, a man in Invercargill at a meeting I conducted bragged that he was growing a plant that was 28%, and he promised it would blow your mind. And so the problem is today's users are already accustomed to a product far stronger than the one being sold by the government. But our real problem is twofold. That commercialism means that both markets start to grow again. Yes, the black market takes a hit to their income initially, but then they start to recover and both markets start to grow. And so what we see is overall use increases. In Canada, 14% use among 15-year-olds and above became 18% use in just a year. And in the year following legalization, 27% of 15 to 25-year-olds, an increase of 27% of use within that age group. So young people, minors, those whose brains are still developing, whose brains are most susceptible to the effects of cannabis, there was a 27% increase in that group. 600,000 Canadians tried cannabis for the first time. The problem is the developing brain is, unfortunately, deeply affected by cannabis. If you start smoking as a teenager, you're 4 times more likely to develop psychosis and 4 times more likely to develop cannabis use disorder, which is the official name for addiction. And so this is what's happening in jurisdictions around the world. So in Canada now, among 15 to 25-year-olds, 30% of them are using cannabis. In California, 29% of them are using. In Colorado, their young people are now the #1 users of cannabis in that age group in all of the US. So wherever we find legalization, we find increased use in total, and we find both markets growing eventually, and we find that young people are using more than ever. The problem is also people don't just smoke the stuff anymore. There's a variety of products, including vaping, but more concerningly, edibles. Now, edible products range from 60% THC right up to 95% THC. Remember, the Woodstock weed was just 3%, and now we're talking about products that are 90% THC. Now, they won't be permitted under the new law, but the New Zealand police said that just empowers the gangs. It tells the gangs which products to specialize in. And only 6 weeks ago, we saw a woman in Hamilton arrested for trying to sell edibles through social media. So we know they're here, and we know that they'll become more prolific under legalization because the black market will specialize in high potency, low cost products. That's what they do. Of course, now we've got this product being available in your home, 4 plants being grown, untested plants, and where you can sell 14 grams a day or purchase 14 grams under the shop. If you grow your own, you can give away 14 grams of cannabis every day, half an ounce every day. You can be what's been dubbed a green fairy. And this is where those who are complaining about the medicinal law are hoping that this is some kind of win for patients. But we need to be very clear in this referendum, medicinal cannabis is already legal in New Zealand. As of April 1st of this year, all of the changes to that law came into effect. And so when you hear the yes advocates say that it will increase access to medicinal cannabis, know that the doctors don't believe that the plant you grow at home is medicine. You don't grow medicine, you don't smoke medicine, and primarily you don't smoke it because you can't dose yourself correctly. And one study that's just recently been published came out with 46 different drugs that will stop working medication that you might be on if you start adding cannabis. And so to start using cannabis medicinally outside of the doctor's prescription, outside of the chemist, is dangerous. So know this, friends, the New Zealand Medical Association opposes this referendum, and so does the New Zealand Respiratory Foundation. The people who care for the sick say this is not a good law and that they want nothing to do with recreational cannabis. And that's all we are talking about is recreational cannabis. The other problem is a social justice one that concerns Christians deeply, and that is that the shops traditionally target the poorer neighborhoods. Sadly, vulnerable communities, communities of color, are far more likely to use cannabis, and therefore that's where the shops will open. That's where the booze shops are in South Auckland, where I was working for 6 months, and you can be sure that's where the cannabis shops will be. Now, hear this. In Denver, Colorado, in the poor suburbs of Denver, there's one cannabis dispensary, a legal cannabis shop, for every 47 adults. For every 47 adults. The poor will have what little they have taken from them. And if you hear those say, oh, but it'll generate tax income, understand this, that according to the Centennial Institute in Colorado, for every dollar of tax you earn through the sale of cannabis, you have to create $4.50 worth of social harm. It simply does not work. And that's why Say No to Dope exists, to alert people to the fact that in every jurisdiction that we've looked at, overall cannabis use has gone up, and use among young people, the mental health effects are disastrous. The health effects in general are terrible. In Canada, every day, 30 teenagers are hospitalized for their reactions to cannabis, psychosis, panic attacks. This is terrible stuff, friends. It's high potency stuff. And to give a sense too of just how high is, according to medical clinical literature, the mark for high cannabis potency is 10%. And our government is advocating the sale of products up to 15% THC. So we're not advocating as a group for prohibition. We don't think that people should, in fact, get a criminal conviction simply for smoking a joint. But we don't believe that we should open the floodgates to commercialization either. That, in fact, we can continue to work on health and education programs without changing the legal status. We already have an informal kind of decriminalization that the New Zealand police are already exercising. And for the sake of clarifying a technicality, throwing a generation of young people under the proverbial bus just simply doesn't make sense. Now, I could speak and do speak for great lengths of time about this, but I think that in summary, you and I would agree that addiction plays no part in the good life that Jesus offers us, that it plays no part in the abundant life. And so people of faith are typically in agreement that this is bad news. Usually once people understand that we're not talking about medicinal, we're only talking about recreational, they realize that this is not actually a good move for a society. So I have some prayer points that I'd invite you to share in tonight. I want to add to them, actually. I'd like to add myself to them, if I may, because in the last week, I was involved in 2 public debates where I was the only voice representing the no side, and I had to go up against 2 people in both debates. And one of those debates, the host organization was a pro-cannabis group, so it was effectively 3 against 1. And I'll be honest, friends, I had a tough weekend. I felt very discouraged. I felt beat up because it's very hard to debate against 2 people. I'm happy to go toe-to-toe with another person in a debate, but when it's me versus a team, that's tough. So I covet your prayers. I genuinely desire that prayer support because we're about to enter into a very difficult time. But here are the 3 prayer points for tonight. Let's make sure that this message of that medicinal cannabis is already legal really infiltrates the public arena. Another great article and stuff today by a doctor highlighting this, and yet so many people seem to have missed the news that medicinal cannabis is already legal. We just need to fix that law, not bring in a new one. Let's consider our young people. You know, we've gone into lockdown, well, certainly those of us in Auckland have, to protect the elderly. We understand that a certain group are more vulnerable than others to coronavirus. But when it comes to cannabis, it's not the elderly, it's the young who we need to protect, because your prefrontal cortex doesn't stop developing until you're 25. So using cannabis between your teens and early 20s can create some serious long-term irreversible damage. We need to pray for our young people. And some of them, the most affected, won't get a vote, the under 18s. By the way, that age limit of 20, I mentioned, a New Zealand Medical Journal article published just 2 weeks ago said that that number was completely arbitrary, that either it should be 25 or nothing at all, because 20 was arbitrary. And for those of us who remember alcohol being 20, those under 20 had no trouble getting it. And finally, this particular referendum, unlike the end of life Choice Act, which is a binding referendum. This one's non-binding. So of course we had the risk that the government will hear a no vote from the people, but somehow ignore it. And we need to believe and to pray that God will hold our leaders to account, to listen to the will of the people. The current stats, by the way, have the no vote in the Colmar-Brunton poll at 49% and the yes vote at 40%. And some other research that we've been privy to shows that the no vote is even further ahead than that. We don't want to be complacent, but there's a good chance that we can send a very strong signal to the government. So bless you. Thank you for your time tonight.